Hello. Can I buy an annual season ticket here for travel to London on the worst capital disconnect operated Thameslink train service to include a daily underground journey?
Now that's quality content. That's the kind of stuff that I can really appreciate. I stand by this and whatever this is.
Nostalgia. We all get nostalgic over a lot of things, right? Whether it be your childhood, a decade, a favourite TV show, etc. Now for me, I like to get nostalgic about a lot of things, and if you look at how horribly, disgustingly, and if you look at how god-awful this decade has been, it is nice to have a look back on the days when our lives were simpler and better. And quite recently, I've been getting nostalgic about something. A train operating company called First Capital Connect. For those who don't know anything about First Capital Connect, either because you're a new gen, or you're American, or you live under a rock, like me. First Capital Connect was a train operating company, or TOC, in the UK, lasting from 2006 to 2014. Now, why do I get so nostalgic about a train operating company of all things? Well, you see, back in my day, before my family had the money to buy a car, we used to travel by train all the time. And before I moved to the London Borough of Southwark, my family used to live in Crofton Park in Lewisham, and we used First Capital Connect all the time, since it was our local train operator. So naturally, I've developed a lot of fond memories about First Capital Connect. I used to always love travelling on the old Class 319s, screaming through the tunnels to St Pancras. I don't know how to describe it, but seeing a 1980s built train like the Class 319 thrashing its electric motors through the Thameslink core, there's just something about that long gone era that has a unique charm to it. You know what I mean? But anyway, of course, I'm well aware of the fact that I'm looking at this long gone era through rose-tinted glasses, because First Capital Connect in actuality sucked.
This is disgusting. This is awful in every way.
So terrible, in fact, that there was even a petition submitted to the government demanding to strip First Capital Connect of its franchise entirely. The same government where it was led by a man at the time who called a woman who was concerned about immigration a bigot.
Should never have put me up with that woman. Whose idea was that?
I don't know, I didn't see.
It's Sue, I think.
What did she say?
Oh, everything. She's just a sort of bigoted woman.
Oh, great heavens! But why was First Capital Connect so notorious? Well, the answer to that question is this video. In this video, I'll be explaining the history of First Capital Connect and talking about everything that went wrong with the company which led to its demise in September of 2014. Talking about the issues and the controversies that the company faced. Okay, I've rambled far too long at this point, let's get straight into it. So how did First Capital Connect came to be? Well, let's start by looking at the franchise that First Capital Connect was awarded to operate. So the First Capital Connect company itself was the first company to operate under the new Thameslink Great Northern franchise. The Thameslink Great Northern franchise itself was a completely new franchise, having been made from a merger with the former Thameslink franchise, operating from South London to Luton and Bedford via the Thameslink core from London Blackfriars to King's Cross, which was owned by Govia at the time of the merger, and the Great Northern part, operating from King's Cross to Peterborough, Cambridge and King's Lynn, of the former West Anglia Great Northern franchise, which was owned by a private company called West Anglia Great Northern. Yeah, very original name, am I right? Now, the reasons why these two franchises were merged into one big franchise is because it was all in preparation for a project called the Thameslink Programme, or Thameslink 2000 as was originally known. The Thameslink Programme itself was a £6 billion project that aimed to completely modernise the existing Thameslink core. It promised things like cross journeys from the south to the north with a new tunnel connected the Thameslink core to the East Coast Main Line, new rolling stock, and newly refurbished stations. As well as a new service timetable that basically gave the Thameslink core a London Underground level of frequency, seeing 24 trains travelling through the core every hour. The project was first proposed all the way back in 1991, following the success of the initial Thameslink service operated by British Rail in 1988. However, something, money, politics kept delaying the project for years on end until finally permission was granted by the government a year after the formation of the Thameslink Great Northern franchise. Funding was approved in 2007, construction began in 2009, and the rest is history. Anyway, what the fuck was I meant to be talking about? Oh yeah, right. The Thameslink Great Northern franchise, First Capital Connect, let's go! On the 8th of April 2005, the Strategic Rail Authority announced that 7 companies had been chosen for the new Thameslink Great Northern franchise. Those companies were Danish State Railways and EWS under a joint venture, First Group, a UK-based transport conglomerate that operates buses as well as a handful of train operating companies, John Liang, whatever, and MTR, also under a joint venture, National Express, and Stagecoach. And on the 13th of December 2005, the chosen company was okay, fuck it, you know what company won the franchise? The clue was in the fucking title. It was First Group. Release the balloons and the confetti! I need to stop unintentionally dragging out my videos, dude. So now that we know how the Thameslink Great Northern franchise and how First Capital Connect came to be, let's get a little overview of the company itself. Like how did the operator function, the name, the branding, what trains it used, etc. So First Capital Connect was the only Thameslink operator to not use the name Thameslink, and the reasons why First Group opted to call it First Capital Connect was because 1. First Group always liked slapping their names on their train operating companies at the time, and 2. They chose the name Capital Connect to reflect the operator's overall function, which is to connect regions outside of London to the capital. Pretty obvious. Why the fuck am I even explain this? Now, as for their branding, before First Group used different names and colours for the branding of their train operating companies, First Group used to use a unified brand for their train operating companies in the 2000s. The designs were slightly different, like for example, First Trans-Pennine Express used swirling shapes, while First Capital Connect used straight lines. But for the overall theme of First Group's branding for their train operators, they used a unified identity for their train operating companies using the same colours, which consisted of a blue and magenta livery with grey, silver and pink lining. So when it came to First Capital Connect, First Group applied that same unified style, but with some differences. Blue and magenta was used for the bodies of their trains, pink was used for the doors, and straight blue, white and pink stripes were applied at the bottom and in each side of the coaches. Apparently First Capital Connect's branding is supposed to represent the theme of a motorsport racing team, although what makes the livery look like a motorsport racing team, I have no idea. I just found this from a website called Axiom Communications. I loved First Group's unified look for their TOCs. Also, the liveries of Southwest Trains and Noex Southeast is one of my favourite livery designs ever. Say what you will about First Group, but they really knew how to make a brand that could stand out, as well as being instantly recognisable. Anyway, tangent over. What trains did First Capital Connect operate? Well, First Capital Connect just basically acquired all of the rolling stock that was used from the former Thameslink and West Anglia Great Northern franchises, being the Class 319s, trains that were built specifically for the Thameslink service and had the ability to switch to AC or DC power, the Class 365s, the Class 321s, the Class 317s, and the Class 313s. The only modern trains First Capital Connect had in their fleet at the time were 23 Class 377-5 Electrostars, as well as a small number of 11 Class 377-2 Electrostars that were on hire from Southern Rail. And that's pretty much it. So like I said before, First Capital Connect lasted from April 2006 to September of 2014. Now, ignoring the title of this video for a second, on the surface you would think that First Capital Connect could have been a very good train operating company, seeing as they were owned by a corporation who were really successful in the public transport market. I mean, they literally had an empire of bus operators, as well as running several other train operating companies before First Capital Connect was even a thing. First Group had experience, and naturally, those with knowledge and experience in an industry tend to be better. However, even when First Capital Connect just started, the company was already experiencing criticism and low customer satisfaction. And from then on, it grew from criticism to controversy. And now, without further ado, let's now talk about everything that went wrong with First Capital Connect. So what were the issues with First Capital Connect exactly? Well, the first problem that First Capital Connect had was its expensive fares. To be honest, when you compare First Capital Connect's fares to the disgusting prices of a fancy West Coast tickets, a train operator that's just as shit as First Capital Connect, if not worse, it isn't that bad. But in late 2000s, early 2010 standards, First Capital Connect's fares were outrageous. In the first year of First Capital Connect's operation, the company introduced evening peak restrictions on journeys from London, which caused ticket prices for commuters to go as high as £21 for a a single journey. And because of the fact that First Capital Connect's evening peak restrictions were put in place from 4 o'clock in the evening, this also affected students in full-time education, forcing them to pay £300 a year for their tickets. First Capital Connect did combat this particular problem for students though, by introducing Student Connect season tickets, which were 50% off of regular adult fares. However, despite this, the Student Connect tickets were only available for specific routes and certain stations, meaning that for students living in other parts of the First Capital Connect network where the Student Connect tickets weren't valid, they still had to pay the full price of a regular adult fare in the evening peak. Revenue protection was also a massive problem. Now, I hate anyone who fare dodges as much as the next guy, and everyone should pay their ticket. But when it comes to revenue protection and ensuring passengers pay their tickets, First Capital Connect took these things way too seriously. They ordered their revenue protection officers to use aggressive and intimidating tactics for enforcement, and some officers even used Stasi-style tactics, basically treating passengers like criminals until they're innocent. So basically, First Capital Connect hired people that were the equivalent of Discord mods. First Capital Connects were also very aggressive when it came to penalty fares. One time in a 4-week period alone, 6,000 penalty fares were issued. Now you might be thinking, well, this surely could be a good thing, right? And on paper, yes, it does sound like a good thing. But when I say First Capital Connect took penalty fares seriously, they took issuing penalty fares absurdly seriously. To the point where even if you did a simple, honest mistake, First Capital Connect would still slap you in the face with a penalty fare. You don't use the First Capital Connect website and you had a problem with a faulty ticket machine and you couldn't buy a ticket? Fuck you, here's your penalty fare. And finally, overcrowding and delays were also a major problem for First Capital Connect. There's a series on YouTube called Why I Hate First Capital Connect, made by a creator called Eclectic. The videos on this playlist show just how bad First Capital Connect was, and it particularly highlights the overcrowding problem with the company. Despite the fact that the stations in the Thameslink core has their platforms livened to enable 12-car trains, thanks to the Thameslink program, First Capital Connect still ran several trains in 8-car and even 4-car formations during rush hour. A certain video on the Why I Hate First Capital Connect playlist also shows how terrible First Capital Connect was at handling delays. A common practice that First Capital Connect did to reduce delays was to basically have stopper services skip several stations. So that way when the train can get to its destination, it can arrive on time.
They could have actually helped people by making that stop at the intermediate stations. But no, they want it to arrive on time when it gets to Luton or Bedford, because that means it's on time at its point of arrival, its terminus, which means it's on time as far as the government statistics go.
The issues of First Capital Connect eventually led to backlash from both commuters and the media. In 2013, a Which survey rated First Capital Connect as one of the worst operators in Britain, with only a mere 40% in customer satisfaction. The company was also mocked on the internet, with several people giving the company silly names such as Worst Capital Connect and the all-time classic Worst Capital Disconnect. However, First Capital Connect were not just known for their problems. The company was also known for being in the center of controversy. So during First Capital Connect's tenure, the company got involved in 3 major controversies. But what were those controversies exactly? Well, let's go over each of them individually. Controversy number 1, the St Albans incident. In September of 2010, a passenger had fallen ill, and a member of staff at the station advised him to get off early at St Albans station. So the passenger did just that. However, when he got off at St Albans station, the passenger just collapsed onto the platform. There were staff at the station, however they did absolutely nothing, and the passengers had to help him instead. According to First Capital Connect, they said that while their staff are first aid trained, it is company policy for employees to help other employees and not the passengers in medical emergencies. Why was this even company policy in the first place? I have no idea. According to a commuter at St Albans by the name of Rachel Hughes, the staff at St Albans were just milling around, not very certain what to do. In response to the incident, First Capital Connect said that our staff always tried to do their best to help their customers, and our staff did what they could until the emergency services arrived. Right, so according to you, you think staff at your station walking around doing nothing like confused NPCs is somehow doing something to help a sick passenger?
Oh my god, a passenger collapsed! Somebody call a doctor!
Are you gonna do something about it?
Stop running around and help him.
Okay, mate. Controversy number 2, the ticket loophole incident. So remember when I discussed about First Capital Connect ticket prices? There was actually a way passengers could avoid paying the more expensive tickets. In November of 2012, a lawyer by the name of Andrew Myers had found an unintentional loophole in the ticketing. Andrew Myers discovered online that the price of a yearly ticket from St Albans City to London will cost you £3,908, while a yearly ticket from Watford North to London will cost you £3,200, £700 cheaper than the St Albans City ticket. St Albans City and Watford North are on two separate parts of the First Capital Connect network. Yet when Andrew Mars went to the National Rail Inquiry's website, it stated that those with annual Watford North tickets can choose to travel via St Albans. So Andrew Mars did exactly that. However, First Capital Connect eventually became aware of this, and they were furious about it. In January of 2013, First Capital Connect claimed that this ticket was only valid for Elstree. This was, of course, bullshit, considering that the National Rail's Inquiry's website said otherwise. First Capital Connect then forced Andrew Mars to pay a yearly ticket from St Albans to Elstree, costing £1,591. But then he basically pulled out an Uno reverse card and he took First Capital Connect to court to claim it back. The lawsuit was easy for Andrew Mars to win, as despite First Capital Connect's arguments, several organisations, including the Association of Train Operating Companies, told the company that the route Andrew Mars had chosen was in fact valid and First Capital Connect were just straight up lying. Andrew Mars won the case and he was awarded £2,193 by the St Albans County Courts, and FCC's behaviour was deemed as unreasonable. Unfortunately, the loophole Andrew Mars discovered didn't last long after the case, as FCC and the A2C learned that Andrew Mars had in fact discovered that this loophole was a previously unknown anomaly from the days of British Rail. So while First Capital Connect's arguments against Andrew's case were in fact right to an extent, it was still a legal method of travel at the time. So at the end of the day, it was still a major L for FCC and a major W for Andrew Mars. And finally, controversy number 3. I've been saving the best till last. The climate change Twitter drama. Now, this is, in my opinion, one of the most funniest controversies I've ever seen. So in October of 2013, a passenger sent a complaint to the official First Capital Connect account on Twitter, and he complained that despite the mild weather at the time, heaters were still being used on the platform, and he said that leaving heaters on could be a waste of energy and can contribute to climate change, yada yada yada. And what was the response from the official First Capital Connect account on Twitter.com? Did First Capital Connect apologise? Did they reply with a response like how any official account from the company is supposed to respond? No. Whoever happened to be running the First Capital Connect Twitter account was basically one of those chuds who think global warming is a hoax. Basically my twat of a granddad on my mother's side. And in typical Twitter fashion, the guy who was running the account and the guy who complained to FCC started having a full-blown argument about climate change. After that fiasco, the company received huge backlash and was utterly confused as to why the hell climate change denying would be a view of a train operating company, a company that invests in an environmentally friendly mode of transport. Thankfully, First Capital Connect did respond to the backlash, saying climate change denying is in fact not the views of the company. They even went on to show that the company are in fact environmentally aware, highlighting how they've invested in electric car charging points and bike racks. On the 13th of September 2014, First Capital Connect ceased operations as their franchise had ended and First Group couldn't renew. Their operations were then handed over to a new company called Govia Thameslink Railway under a new wider franchise called the Thameslink Southern and Great Northern franchise.
Where did that bring you? Back to me.
And that, my friends, was the story of First Capital Connect, Britain's worst train operator. Now, what do I think about First Capital Connect personally, putting rose-tinted nostalgia aside for a second? Well, in my opinion, First Capital Connect was, in all honesty, a disgrace. And what's even worse about all of this is that the people who were in charge of the company generally thought they did a good job. But despite all of this, I still miss First Capital Connect to this day somewhat. I don't know why, in all honesty. I was a kid at the time during First Capital Connect's tenure, so I guess it's just more of general childhood nostalgia than actually having fond memories of a terrible organisation, if anything. First Capital Connect may have been a very shitty company, with outrageous controversies and valid criticism. But at the same time, I'll miss the vibrant pink, magenta and blue colours, and I'll forever miss the great noises of Class 309s thrashing out St Pancras Station until the day I die.